Hello, everyone, and welcome to Matters of Mind. My name is Thomas, and in this series, I review books on Jordan Peterson's book list. Now, this one wasn't specifically on his great books list, so it's more like a JBP adjacent book. This is The Master and His Emissary by Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Now, if you're a fan of Jordan Peterson and you watch any of his podcasts, then you likely have heard of Dr. McGilchrist. He's been on Dr. Peterson's podcast many times, and it's always a great conversation. And he brings up a lot of really deep, fascinating ideas. So I thought I'd veer a little bit to the left and get something that wasn't specifically on JBP's great books list, but something that anyone who is familiar with Peterson's work would be maybe likely to read or benefit from. Now, what Dr. McGilchrist does is he looks at this left brain, right brain difference. And there's been a lot of work that's looked at the difference between the left and the right brain. And really interestingly, there was a psychologist in the 60s named Dr. Sperry. Now, what Dr. Sperry did is a lot of experimentation on the difference between the left and the right brain. And he came up with a lot of ideas and that have stuck for quite a long time. So people have a tendency to say, well, I'm more left brain or I'm more right brain. The left brain being more analytical, orderly, logical, good with numbers, and the right brain being more imaginative, emotional, intuitive. All those kind of people would split themselves up and say, I'm this brain or I'm that brain. And one of the interesting things is that Sperry actually won a Nobel Prize for his work. But come to find out, decades later, when neuroscientists in 2013 started looking at this, they found that there is no dominance of the left brain and or the right brain. Now, there were some things that were very similar and correct that Sperry found, but it's not that any one person is left or right brain dominant. It's more that the left and the right brain see the world and process information in a different way. Hence the title of the book, The Master and His Emissary. What Dr. McGilchrist is referring to is the right hemisphere being the master and the left hemisphere being the emissary. The master, the right hemisphere, is bringing in all the information as it is, as it exists, as a whole. The left hemisphere tends to reach out and grasp and seek to understand individual pieces of information, which we then should take and reformulate into a way that we can reincorporate into the whole. Abstract thoughts, analytical stuff, seeing things outside of their context as they are on their own is very important and is really centered in a lot of human achievement. But it's also important that we take that information and reincorporate it into the whole to get a better picture of everything as it exists. Now, I'm going to show you a picture, and this is one of the experiences I had while reading this book. And I'll put the picture up here in the video. And I talked about this with a couple of my previous videos, where the more I read about the conscious and unconscious mind, and really as I start to learn about religious ideas and the deeper the things are that I'm reading, I'm starting to have experiences where what I imagine or think is my sub or unconscious, I'm not sure what the difference is there, maybe semantics, will give me a piece of information. Sometimes it's in a dream, sometimes it's while I'm awake. And this happened to me while I was reading this book. It's almost as if a little groundhog pops up and says, hey, I want to tell you something, and then disappears. And I'm more attuned now to being able to recognize that happening and making sure I pay attention to it, think about it, even if I don't get it at the time, and set it aside. And this is what happened while I was reading this book. So I'm going to put up the picture now. Now, this picture is a painting done by Picasso. It's called Woman in a Red Armchair. Now, in the book, the picture is in black and white. So I actually went online and looked up the painting, the one that I'm showing you on the video here, to really see it in color because, I wanted to make sure I knew what I was looking at. And the interesting thing here is as soon as I saw this picture, the little groundhog in my head popped up and said, "That's schizophrenia," and went away. And the way that Dr. McGilchrist describes the manner in which the left hemisphere sees the world and processes information I referred to earlier as in out of context. It's very specific. It's grasping certain things and ideas without the context of the whole within which those concepts, things, ideas exist. And you can see that here with this painting. So if you look carefully, you can see a couple at the bottom left. You can see what's likely a leg. So you can see a thigh and a knee, and I only think that that's a leg because at the bottom of it, where it's kind of bulbous, you can see little lines where it almost looks like toes or fingers split apart. And then on the right side, you can see something similar, which I think might be an arm, because it too has that bulbous area at the end, which might be a hand coming out from the wrist with the little slits that look like they might be fingers. Now, looking at this and thinking, oh, that's a woman in a red armchair, I don't think I would know that unless I saw the title of the painting. And you can see that all the things that are armchair, red, and not armchair, whatever this woman's flesh color is, they're not connected. There's no context to it. If you saw any one of those things on its own, it would be like an arm cut off and laying on the table. You can say, yeah, that's an arm, and I can look at it, I can understand it. But that arm outside of the context of what it's attached to is the essence of the manner in which left hemisphere processes information. And he does a great job in the book of really explaining this. The first, I'd say, 200 pages are full of research and notes and examples of different situations where people were processing information, much like you would see in this picture. And some of it came from schizophrenic patients. So imagine that somebody has some kind of injury, whether it's a physical injury to one side of the brain, whether it's a stroke that damages one side of the brain, or it could be a lesion, so a cancerous lesion on one side of the brain. So what we would see is that people who had lesions on the right side of their brain and were utilizing the left side to make up for that lack of processing power, they tended to exhibit the characteristics that we've described as left brain, to the point where, just like in this picture, you would have patients say that there is somebody with an arm that keeps grabbing me and it doesn't belong to me. And is as if they thought that their own arm belonged to somebody else because they had trouble looking at that arm in the context of their own whole body. And there's a ton of examples of that and how that works. Now, hearing that and understanding a little bit about what left brain processing is like, I want to make sure that I don't give anyone the impression that it's one side bad, one side good, left brain bad, right brain good. It's nothing like that. It really seems that through evolution, we have started to separate those hemispheres. And if you're familiar with brain anatomy at all, in the middle, there's a fibrous connective tissue called the corpus callosum. And it's a network of neurons that help to transmit information between the right and the left. And what they're seeing is that as we've evolved, and especially in even more literate societies, you have a thickening of that. And that, Dr. McGilchrist, is what he is saying is an evolving process towards keeping those two halves separate. And that corpus callosum actually acts not just to pass information back and forth, but almost mostly as a way to inhibit information from going from one side to the other, which is really interesting because as we start to see and understand the difference between those two sides, it's as if we have to have the ability to separate from the whole to understand that individual piece and then incorporate it back into the whole. Whereas if it was one big processing machine and all right brain, then we couldn't get to the details that we need in order to understand the world and manipulate it to our will. So what I'll do is I'll quote Dr. McGilchrist here to get a clear thesis of what this book is all about. My thesis is that for us as human beings, there are two fundamentally opposed realities, two different modes of experience, that each is of ultimate importance in bringing about the recognizably human world, and that their difference is rooted in the bihemispheric structure of the brain. It follows that the hemispheres need to cooperate, but I believe they are in fact involved in a sort of power struggle, and that this explains many aspects of contemporary Western culture. So you can see and hear from that it's not necessarily that one side is better than the other. They're just different, and they're different with a purpose, and that purpose is to be able to do things differently, but then cooperate and bring them together as a whole. So speaking of the whole, I'm going to show you a picture of something that would be essentially the exact opposite of Picasso's painting and what we would see as left brain manner in processing the world. Now this painting you probably recognisisthe This is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. Now what you see here is on the left-hand side, you see the first man, Adam. On the right-hand side, you see the heavens, divinity, God. Now you can see that here, it's not only is it the man himself as a whole piece, there's no separation, it's obviously all one unit. But then you also see man and the divine, so the sacred and the profane. And those two things, even though they're separate, they're coming together and they play off one another. That is much more like what the right brain sees, bringing everything as a whole. Now, the recently deceased Dr. Daniel Dennett pointed out in his book Elbow Room, if you look at that painting, Michelangelo, and especially if you expand it a little bit so you can see the whole part with God and the cherubs on the right-hand side, if you split that in half, if you split a brain in half, and look at it sideways from the inside out, that looks exactly like the right hemisphere of a human brain. Now, I don't know exactly if Michelangelo was thinking that, but Dr. McGilchrist also points out that here, Adam's left hand is reaching toward the divine, and your left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. So even in this picture, the right hemisphere is using its left hand to reach out to the divine, which is encapsulated in what looks like the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, how much Michelangelo knew about the hemispheres and how they control everything, I doubt that he knew it on that specific of a left brain analytical level. But there's a lot of examples Dr. McGilchrist gives in the book about the manner in which poets, artists, philosophers have looked at the nature of humanity in a dual sense, where it was also very often portrayed in a right-left duality. Now, one of my favorite examples of right hemisphere affinity or processing was this, and I'll read the quote and display it here for you. The right hemisphere's affinity for both the perception and expression of emotion appears to be confirmed by the strong universal tendency to cradle infants with their faces to the left, so that they fall within the principal domain of attention of the adult's right hemisphere, and they are exposed to the adult's own more emotionally expressive left hemiface. So I think about my own children, and it was so awkward for me to hold them with their head on this side. I always tended to go this way. And I thought maybe it was because I was right-handed and that's how right-handed people do it. But apparently that's almost universal. Of course, it's never 100%, but people tend to hold children on this side and they will see your left face, which corresponds to the right hemisphere. And he gives a lot of examples of how, even in the animal kingdom, that difference in right and left brain processing happens very similarly with birds using either the right or left eye, depending on what they're looking at, if it's food or if it's a predator. And even this example of holding infants, they see the same thing in chimpanzees, and artwork and descriptions of humans and babies in our own literature, our own history, goes back 3,000 to 4,000 years with a heavy tendency to hold children in that way. I thought that was really fascinating to see. All right, so after going through the process of understanding something that's different about the way the left hemisphere compared to the right hemisphere processes information, Dr. McGilchrist goes on to describe the patterns in the way that we think in the world that tend to shift down this left and right pathway, to where the Renaissance was very much more left oriented, to where that seemed to be the dominant way to understand things, not necessarily looking at the whole and the emotions and the context, but abstract thinking. You see that with Platonism, to where even with Plato, I remember reading, I think in the Republic, where he said the best way to understand the heavens is to think about the heavens themselves and not to utilize your sense by seeing the heavens and seeing the stars, which tells us that they were much more about utilizing analytics and our reason and our thought process, as opposed to utilizing our own senses and the emotion that those things stir. Then you have the Romantic period, which tended to go much more towards looking at that holistic picture while still incorporating some of those left brain things. Now, if you want to look at what is happening in our world now, I think what happened with COVID was a perfect example of what happens when we are shifted way to the left with left hemisphere processing. So if you remember, a lot of our policies seem to be aimed at the idea that we can just smash COVID whatsoever. And we got so much tunnel vision on COVID, the disease, as needing to be eliminated. And we even heard the zero COVID policies in some countries as if that was a possibility. But what a lot of people didn't do is look at the whole context. Like, sure, we don't want people to get sick from COVID, but what about what happens to kids when they're not in school for a long period of time? What happens to families when they're not connected to each other, or people not connected to their communities? You know, there's a whole lot of things that we have to look at in context, but a left hemisphere processing would only look at one thing, get obsessed with that one thing, and then do its best to ignore and diminish anything that would go contrary to that. And we would see that with, as early as October 2020, doctors, epidemiologists like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, along with hundreds and now thousands of people who signed on to this, were saying, hey guys, maybe we should be a little bit more holistic about this and consider other things. And in retrospect, you know, they were of course correct. We didn't do any risk stratification there. We were looking solely at everybody as if they were the same unit, and we just had to get rid of COVID. I even remember people feeling guilty about getting COVID as if they did something wrong by getting an airborne disease. It was crazy. But that's a great example of what happens when we move a little bit more towards a strictly analytical left hemisphere world. We're taking things and getting super focused on them outside of their context, and that can be a bit damaging. We always need to take that thing, work it back into the context of the whole in order to make our whole map of the world more detailed and more helpful. All right, one more quote that relates to that. The left hemisphere view offers simple answers. Its mode of thinking prizes consistency above all and claims to offer the same mechanistic models to explain everything that exists. This thinking is common to those who espouse naive reductionist scientism, enthusiasts for technological solutions to what are complex human problems, and designers and implementers of bureaucratic systems. When this sort of thinking encounters a problem in reconciling apparent irreconcilables, for example, matter and consciousness, it simply denies that one element or the other exists. Now that sounds a lot like some of our policies during that period of COVID, to where we just pretended, that those other things didn't exist. And if we saw them pop up, we had to cancel them, get them off of social media, as opposed to just dealing with them and looking at all of the context that we necessarily needed to do. Now, what this book really did for me is help to clarify my map of the world through understanding a map of the brain and how it processes information differently from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. And some of the stuff I saw was really relevant to me in the work I do. I work in healthcare, and I look at a lot of data analytics and setting goals. But there's also, an important thing not to do is get so set on the goals and the data and the statistics that you're not looking at why you need those statistics in the first place. What's the big picture? How does that fit into everything else? And making sure we're not getting so obsessed with those things. So I think we're all capable of going a little bit one direction or the other. One thing that he didn't mention, and it might be simply because of the timing of this book, I don't remember, it was published, I think, in 2007, copyright 2009. Dr. Joseph Henrich has written a book called Weird, which is Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, and how, and in part what he talks about is how literacy has actually changed the structure of our brain. And one of those things was thickening the corpus callosum, which Dr. McGilchrist talks about as being the thing that helps to mediate the information through an inhibitory fashion between the left and right brain. So I would be interested to hear what Dr. McGilchrist would say about the changing world and how literacy has changed the structure of the brain and obviously has changed the Western world, and how that might have an effect on the long-term expectations of how those two sides work together, and whether or not that's going to have any big impact. So much like any other book that's really deep and really important, I did feel like I got a glimpse into the matrix a little bit. I'm seeing the code a little bit more, and I understand what's underneath a lot of the concepts and ideas and conversations we're having. And I definitely recommend it to anybody. My next book that I'll be reviewing is Volume 3, A History of Religious Ideas. And I've already done 1 and 2. Those videos are up. And I'm about to be done with this whole master load of religious ideas, which will essentially make me the expert in religious ideas. Far from it. So if you like and subscribe, I really appreciate it. It helps the channel. I'm looking forward to any comments, and hopefully one day we can get together and read some of these books as a group. I'd love to do that sometime. So everyone have a great afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you happen to be, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.